Tonight, we're not beginning with a grand battle, a pious sermon, or some powdered aristocrat declaring war over a fruit shipment. No, tonight, we're talking about something far more dangerous, intricate, and wildly awkward than any of those. Medieval dating. Because if you think modern romance is complicated with its left swipes, vague emojis, and what are we? Conversations at 1 a.m., just wait until you see how love bloomed, if you can even call it that, in an age of plagues, dowries, and arranged livestock transactions. Picture it, the year is 1327. You're standing in a muddy village square that smells faintly of damp wool, onions, and impending moral judgment. Maybe you're in a castle with drafty stone corridors and tapestries depicting saints with wildly unrealistic beards. Either way, you find yourself wondering, with the subtlety of a monk eyeing the last meat pie, how one might go about meeting a potential partner in such a world. Spoiler alert, you don't. Not in the way you're thinking. Forget casual flirting, secret glances by the ale cart, or chance meetings at the well. This isn't a rom-com. This is the Middle Ages, where dating as a concept didn't exist. You wouldn't take a stroll to see where it goes. You wouldn't pen a charming note hoping to spark a dalliance. No. Your future marriage, your destiny, and your entire reproductive career were being negotiated by your parents, your lord, and possibly a particularly influential pig. If you were noble, chances are you'd been betrothed since you were barely tall enough to steal bread from the table. Your marriage wasn't about romance. It was about land, alliances, treaties, and whether your family needed those 3 acres by the river more than they needed to avoid having dinner with the Fitzhughs. You'd meet your spouse for the first time on your wedding day, which was about as nerve-wracking as it sounds. If you were a peasant, things were slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still had opinions, and so did the community, which functioned like a medieval version of an aggressively nosy neighborhood Facebook group. Marriages were built on practicalities. Whose field bordered whose, how many chickens you could bring to the table, and whether your prospective partner could thatch a roof without tumbling off it into a puddle of manure. Falling in love before marriage was risky. Falling in love outside of marriage was scandalous. And loving someone your parents hadn't pre-approved was asking for trouble, unless you were a tragic ballad character, in which case, by all means, die dramatically in a field of heather. But people are people. Even in a world ruled by property rights and the church calendar, hearts still misbehaved. Maybe you wrote a clumsy poem about someone's hair glinting like ripe barley. Maybe you slipped them a carved spoon. Maybe you offered the miller's apprentice a slightly withered apple and got a blush in return. Romance was low-key, practical, and highly subject to public opinion. Because before you could even consider a courtship, you had to ask yourself a serious question. What exactly do I bring to this transaction? If you were a young man, the answer better involved land, livestock, a trade, or at the very least, a solidly built roof. Charming eyes and a clever tongue wouldn't fill a granary or mend a fence. The suitor with 2 healthy oxen had a better shot than the one who wrote ballads. If your family's best goat was already promised to your older brother, the priesthood suddenly looked like a great career option. If you were a young woman, your family was expected to produce a dowry. That could be money, a patch of land, or a stack of linen sheets. No dowry meant your prospects dimmed significantly. You could be the brightest mind in the village, but without coin or a few extra geese, you'd spend your evenings embroidering handkerchiefs and wistfully watching others flirt at the harvest fair. Let's imagine you actually liked someone. Maybe it was the way they confidently carried a basket of turnips. Maybe they didn't immediately throw your slightly cracked mug into the fire when you offered it. Romantic, right? Doesn't matter. Unless your families were on equal financial footing, you might as well have fallen for a passing cloud. For nobles, it was worse. Your hand in marriage was a political weapon. You weren't a person, you were a chess piece. Marriages brokered lands, fortified alliances, and settled disputes. Love. That was for troubadours and people too poor to matter. Even peasants didn't escape the practicality. You didn't marry for butterflies. You married because your pigsty backed onto someone else's barley field and the irrigation rights made sense. And yet, there was always a spark somewhere. You offered a token, a spoon, a carved button, a wilted flower. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they ignored you. But every single courtship act had to be weighed against the balance of power, economy, and who owned the best livestock in the county. In medieval dating, flirtation was economics. Love was a risky afterthought you hoped would show up in the winter months when you were snowed in together. If you weren't a peasant or a lord, but a knight, things got even weirder. Enter the world of courtly love, an elaborate, exhausting, entirely impractical emotional pantomime wherein you, a shiny helmeted knight, would pick a lady to adore from afar. Ideally, one already married. You would write her dreadful poetry, swear fealty to her beauty, and spend years pining from across a crowded hall. Physical contact was out of the question. Actually speaking was suspect. You were expected to suffer beautifully, perhaps jousting anyone who glanced at her for too long and composing odes about her vaguely described hair. The lady's job: to accept your over-the-top adoration with the cool detachment of a sentient glacier. Maybe she'd toss you a ribbon at a tournament. Maybe she wouldn't. The entire thing functioned like a very elaborate improv performance where no one admitted it was pretend. A single misstep in what was supposed to be elegant yearning turned into a full-blown scandal, adultery, or an invitation to a very public hanging. And yet, courtly love wasn't entirely meaningless. It served as a release valve in a society where marriages were contracts and emotions were liabilities. It let knights and ladies play at longing without toppling the fragile social order. It was melodrama with plausible deniability. When direct courtship was impossible, tokens stepped in. Think of them as medieval text messages, only made of cloth and vastly more confusing. A glove pinned to your tunic might mean devotion. A ribbon tied to your sword hilt might mean hope, or it might mean the laundry maid accidentally dropped it. The meaning was deliberately cryptic. The more mysterious the better, because ambiguity kept you safe. Oh, this glove. No, it's not from Lady Joan. It appeared on my pillow. Must be a coincidence. Smells like lavender, though. For commoners, tokens were simpler but no less meaningful. A carved spoon, a handkerchief embroidered by moonlight, a suspiciously symmetrical turnip, all spoke volumes in a world where you weren't allowed to openly say, "I like you." But tokens were dangerous too. Give the wrong one to the wrong person, and rumors would spread like candle wax on hot stone. Receive one from someone undesirable, and you'd have to navigate how to return it without sparking a feud or an emergency sermon. Yet for all the strictures and side-eyes, those tokens carried real weight. A ribbon wasn't just fabric, it was possibility. A handkerchief was hope disguised as embroidery. In a world where falling in love could be a social liability, these tiny gestures became acts of quiet rebellion. Now, let's say, against all odds and in defiance of several chaperones, you manage to actually get close to your crush. Perhaps you both reach for the same chunk of bread at the market stall. Maybe you exchange a few polite words about the weather. In medieval terms, this is basically an emotional scandal. Congratulations, you're now the talk of the village. And unfortunately for you, medieval society had about as much privacy as an open-air privy during a feast. You weren't alone. Ever. If you so much as lingered by the ale barrel a little too long while glancing in someone's general direction, expect your mother, your priest, and at least 2 old women with reputations for minding other people's business to take immediate interest. Every interaction was supervised like an anxious hen watching a wayward chick. If you were a young woman, you'd never just go for a stroll. No, you went for a stroll with your cousin Margaret and Margaret's terrifying aunt, who considered it her divine duty to measure how close you stood to the miller's apprentice. Fetching water wasn't a solitary task either. Someone always came along, and usually someone nosy. Even your accidental meeting at the well would happen under the sharp gaze of the village elder, who definitely saw everything. If you were a man hoping to court a woman, You'd better have the approval of her family, the priest, and whatever self-appointed gossip captain presided over your corner of the world. You'd show up at her cottage with a bundle of firewood or a slightly cracked mug you'd whittled by firelight. Her father would greet you while polishing a suspiciously sharp object. Her mother would feign interest in a pot that hadn't contained anything edible in hours. And the priest would inevitably be passing by on his way to prayers, which conveniently took him past the scene of every significant conversation in town. The logic behind this oppressive supervision was simple. Virtue needed protecting, family honor had to be preserved, and absolutely no unsanctioned hand-holding was to occur. Chaperones hovered over interactions like vultures over a battlefield. A group outing to the market, supervised. A walk to the fields, supervised. Sitting on a bench within 2 feet of each other, allowed only if at least one elderly relative was present and knitting aggressively nearby. Even the church had opinions, dozens of them. Priests delivered sermons condemning the dangers of flirtation, publishing treatises on the moral hazards of casual glances. Monasteries sometimes opened love letters to screen for inappropriate metaphors. Divine censorship was real, and if your poetry contained anything more suggestive than "thy eyes resemble the morning sun," you might find yourself on the business end of a lengthy confession. And yet people managed. Humanity is stubborn that way. Love letters existed, passed from hand to trembling hand. Secret rendezvous occurred, carefully scheduled between the evening bell and Aunt Agnes's bedtime. A nod across a feast hall could contain volumes. In this world of chaperones and rules, subtlety was king. If you couldn't speak openly, you wrote. Letters were dangerous, romantic, and the medieval equivalent of jumping out a window. You didn't just say, "I like you." You wrote something like, "My soul is a wounded stag roaming the woods of your grace," and hoped no one intercepted it. Vellum scraps were inked by candlelight, perfumed with stolen flower petals and smuggled by servants, monks, or a small, bribable sibling. Delivering the letter was a problem of its own. You couldn't hand it over directly. That would be social suicide. You needed a messenger, a loyal maid, a complicit minstrel, or that cousin who was bad at keeping secrets but excellent at climbing trellises. Letters were risky business. A misplaced metaphor could hint at scandalous things. One clumsy turn of phrase about your lady's blushes resembling ripe apples might be construed as a confession of lust, and get you hauled before the parish priest for a stern lecture, and a penance involving cold water and a lot of fasting. Even so, people risked it. Some of those letters survived, copied by scribes who appreciated a good bit of melodrama. A folded scrap of vellum carried more weight than a dozen church decrees. It was a rebellion, a whispered defiance of the expected order, a tiny, ink-stained promise that maybe, somewhere beneath the layers of duty and obligation, a real human heart still beat. Occasionally, a festival offered a reprieve from relentless supervision. Feast days, harvest fairs, and midsummer dances provided one of the rare socially acceptable opportunities for young people to mingle, laugh, and dare we suggest it, flirt. These were chaotic, muddy affairs involving livestock competitions, ale consumption, and the occasional peasant attempting to balance a sack of grain on their head. But they were also prime romantic hunting grounds. At a fair, you might impress your crush by winning a sack race, catching a greased pig, or surviving a wrestling match with your dignity mostly intact. Dancing was your best shot at genuine physical contact. The steps were carefully choreographed to keep people at a respectable distance, but a well-timed spin or an artful stumble could lead to the briefest of hand grazes. The maypole dance was the medieval version of a flirtatious group text, ribbons and plausible deniability everywhere. If you were noble, your version of flirting at a festival involved less mud and more poetry. You might pen a verse comparing your lady's eyes to twin candles, or her hair to flaxen waves under a harvest moon. You'd offer a trinket, a brooch, a ribbon, or a small hand mirror, and if she accepted with a smile rather than flinging it into a nearby brazier, you'd consider the evening a roaring success. Of course, nothing happened without witnesses. Every look, every gesture, every offhanded compliment about someone's ability to churn butter was observed, recorded, and dissected by a network of professional busybodies, whose entire social currency rested on knowing who fancied whom. A single misplaced smile could become fodder for weeks of speculative embroidery sessions. But for a few hours at the harvest fair, or beneath a lantern-strung oak during midsummer, you could almost pretend love wasn't a transaction. That hearts didn't need the blessing of bishops and fathers with suspiciously sharpened pitchforks. You could laugh, trade riddles, maybe sneak a ribbon into someone's sleeve. And for those precious hours, the world looked a little less practical and a little more foolishly hopeful. Not that anyone expected it to last. Now, let's imagine you've managed the impossible. You've endured the glances, the chaperones, the sermons about virtue, the possibly cursed love letter, and the emotionally charged exchange of a ribbon near a cider barrel. You've danced the maypole, juggled a questionable meat pie, and perhaps even offered a hand-carved spoon. Miraculously, feelings have been mutually, if discreetly, acknowledged. The families have been bribed or badgered into agreement. It's happening. You're getting married. Only, let's be very clear about what that meant in the Middle Ages. Marriage wasn't a dreamy, rose-petal-strewn vow under a sky full of stars. It was a legally binding, often brutally practical contract. A union of livestock, land, coin, and family obligations sealed with a ceremony you probably didn't understand because it was in Latin. For peasants, the wedding might be a gathering of a few neighbors, a priest, and a pig roast. Someone would spill ale on your only good tunic. The priest would mumble blessings while children pelted each other with stale bread. And behind it all would be the unspoken checklist: dowry secured, fields properly negotiated, who gets the donkey if someone dies unexpectedly next spring. For nobles, it was worse. Entire families gathered to haggle terms while the bride and groom stood awkwardly nearby, dressed in finery that didn't quite fit and expected to look agreeable while treaties were negotiated over their heads. You might never have spoken more than a dozen words to the person you were about to swear to spend eternity with. You were a treaty, an estate merger, a strategic alliance in human form. Love was optional. The ink on the property agreements was not. And once those vows were said, those coins exchanged, those witnesses assembled, it was permanent. Divorce wasn't a thing, not in any form you'd recognize. Annulments existed, but they required ludicrously specific conditions. One of you had to be underage, already married to someone else, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often, or, the ultimate medieval deal-breaker, have never consummated the marriage, which meant someone somewhere had to testify to that fact. In writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. For nobles, marital unhappiness was less a private matter and more a political liability. Attempting to escape a bad marriage could launch a blood feud or trigger a minor war. Best case scenario, you and your spouse quietly resented each other for 30 years while attending separate feasts. Worst case, someone ended up excommunicated, imprisoned, or conveniently falling from a parapet. So what did unhappy couples actually do? Mostly they endured. You found hobbies. You cultivated dramatic sighing. You took up embroidery or falconry or poetry that subtly hinted at your discontent. Passive aggression became an art form. And of course, there were affairs. Nobles had discreet lovers, peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbors, and everyone blamed it on fate, the devil, or the weather. Women in particular had it rough. If your husband was cruel, absent, or generally unbearable, you were expected to endure with grace, piety, and an expression of mild gratitude. Even if he vanished for years, gallivanting off on crusade or chasing a passing minstrel, you remained loyal, praying for his soul while secretly hoping a falling roof tile might take care of your problems. A widow was slightly better off. A husband's death, whether by plague, war, accident, or an unfortunate incident involving a startled goose, left you, at least temporarily, independent. Widowhood in the Middle Ages, oddly enough, came with perks. A widow could manage land, make decisions, even speak in public without being immediately shushed. If you were young enough and had teeth remaining, you could remarry with astonishing speed. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with property was a walking jackpot, and suitors would appear with unsettling swiftness. Some brought flowers, others brought pigs. Either way, it wasn't long before proposals arrived, sometimes while the old husband was still technically cooling. Second marriages were often far less about duty and more about pragmatism, and occasionally affection. The expectations had already been shattered once. Now it was about surviving the next winter together. Romance might still be rare, but companionship, cooperation, and a healthy tolerance for each other's relatives counted for a lot. You weren't chasing butterflies. You were chasing a reliable turnip harvest. But before you let your heart run wild, you had to ask one crucial, cosmic question. Were you actually allowed to fall in love with this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of bloodlines, omens, and whether or not Venus was in retrograde. Astrology was taken seriously. Before kissing anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Were your birth signs compatible? Was your beloved born under a lucky star? Had a raven flown overhead while you were daydreaming about them? If so, disaster. Better marry the smith's daughter instead. She didn't have cursed lunar phases. Then there were superstitions. Birthmarks were read like ancient runes. A mole shaped like a crescent moon might mark you as a soulmate, or a bringer of ruin, depending on which way the wind was blowing. The village wise woman, who absolutely wasn't a witch officially, might offer to read bones or consult the patterns in spilled grain to determine your romantic fate. And if your grandmother dreamed of a fox near your door, well, better postpone those wedding plans. Even the church kept a list of forbidden unions. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed without special dispensation, which was conveniently purchasable if you were rich enough. Many noble family trees looked less like orderly diagrams and more like tangled fishing nets. Before things got serious, you'd need to draw up a family chart and quietly erase a few inconvenient uncles. And of course, status mattered. A noble falling for a peasant was scandalous. The sort of thing bards turned into tragic ballads, where someone died in a river and the moral was always know your place. Cross-class romances were rare, and usually ended either in exile or a tearful love song performed on a cracked lute. But for all the rules and warnings, people fell in love anyway. Clumsily, foolishly, often against every reasonable piece of advice. Because the heart, medieval or not, remains wonderfully disobedient. And that in the end is the lesson of medieval dating. For all its rituals, negotiations, and restrictions, it was still a story of people reaching out, however cautiously, however dangerously, toward connection. They scribbled bad poetry by candlelight. They tied ribbons to swords. They braved chaperones, curses, and stern lectures for a chance at a glance, a touch, a quiet moment beneath a harvest moon. They risked everything for the most impractical, unreasonable, utterly human thing in the world: love. And maybe, just maybe, so would you. Now, as much as we've already pulled back the curtain on medieval romance, there's still a world of gloriously inconvenient details left to uncover. Because falling in love in the Middle Ages wasn't just about chaperones and dowries. No, it was also about customs so bizarre, you'd think someone made them up after a few too many tankards of mead. Take the curious practice of love divinations. In a world where medicine was mostly guesswork, and weather forecasts came from the way a cow lay down in the grass, people were understandably obsessed with predicting their romantic futures. If you wanted to know whether your crush returned your affections, or whether you'd end up tragically heartbroken and possibly dead in a field somewhere, you didn't ask them. No, you turned to cabbage stalks, eggshells, and candle wax. One popular method involved placing a peeled apple under your pillow. The theory went that in your dreams, you'd see the face of your future spouse. In practice, you probably saw a terrifying figure vaguely resembling the village blacksmith, or worse, a goat. And yet people did it. There were endless variations: walking backward around a well, staring into a mirror by moonlight, or dropping molten lead into a bowl of water and interpreting the shapes. If the lead formed something vaguely resembling a plow, marriage was imminent. If it looked like a snake, betrayal. If it resembled a lump, which it almost always did, you were probably destined for singlehood and a long, dreary career spinning wool. Another delightful custom involved midsummer bonfires. Young men and women would leap over the flames, and if a couple's leap was timed perfectly, it meant a happy union. If one landed before the other, doom. If someone caught fire, well, that was considered an ill omen too, though mostly for the fire marshal, assuming such a person existed. And then there were charms. Not the "you look charming today" kind, but actual objects intended to secure affection. In some regions, people believed that placing a certain herb under your beloved's pillow would make them fall in love with you. The preferred choice: rosemary. Though if you got it wrong and used something like mandrake, you might just give them vivid nightmares and the inclination to flee the village. Witches, or as they were then known, suspiciously independent women with opinions about herbs, were frequently consulted for love potions. These brews often contained wildly dubious ingredients: crushed beetles, bat wings, wine steeped with specific flowers. Whether they worked is debatable. What's not is that someone somewhere probably drank an awful lot of horrifying things in pursuit of romance. And should you, against better judgment and a list of church prohibitions, fall into a forbidden affair, you'd need to navigate a world of medieval clandestine meetups. There was an entire social art to slipping out unnoticed. A rustling curtain, a candle snuffed in a specific window, a particular pattern of pebbles placed on a windowsill. The signaling systems people developed were more complex than most castle defenses, and the risk was monumental. Discovery meant disgrace at best, death at worst, and an eternity of lurid gossip. But still it happened. Because for all their sermons, treaties, and arranged livestock exchanges, medieval people were human. They longed. They risked. They loved badly, recklessly, and sometimes magnificently. Now, if you thought the apple under the pillow trick was quaint, allow me to introduce you to the medieval art of love augury through household chores. Yes, you heard right. In a time where life was a relentless rotation of thrashing grain, scouring pots, and avoiding dysentery, people somehow still found time to turn their drudgery into fortune-telling rituals. Young women in particular were forever watching the way their bread dough rose, or how a bit of candle grease dripped down a taper, looking for clues about their marital fate. If your dough puffed up nicely and baked to a golden crust, congratulations, you were destined for a sturdy husband with at least one pig and decent teeth. If it burned or cracked, well, you might as well get comfortable with a life of singlehood and bitter mutterings by the hearth. Candles were another favorite. The way a candle flickered, or the direction its smoke drifted, could reveal whether your intended was thinking fondly of you or about to elope with the tanner's niece. Even cheese-making, that most noble of medieval pursuits, carried ominous romantic implications. If your curd separated cleanly, it was a sign of a pure heart. If it clotted awkwardly or refused to set, better prepare for heartbreak. Some girls whispered their sweetheart's name into the milk as it simmered, believing the curd's reaction would reveal his intentions. You had to be discreet about it, though, lest a chaperone overheard and arranged a swift intervention involving cold water and an extended sermon about virtue. And speaking of sermons, few things occupied the medieval clergy like worrying about what the young folk might be doing when no one was looking. It's difficult to overstate how deeply invested the church was in the state of your love life. Every flirtation, every stolen glance, every ribbon pass beneath a trestle table was viewed as a potential gateway to mortal sin. Preachers gave entire sermons warning against the dangers of lustful glances, idle conversation, and, God forbid, laughter between unmarried people. Yes, even shared jokes could be suspect. After all, what was humor if not a short, dangerous step toward lasciviousness? Some especially devout towns maintained public confession boards where villagers could anonymously report one another for inappropriate behavior. Saw Thomas linger too long by the well. Agnes wore her hair loose on Sunday. Marjorie smiled at the butcher. Real notes. Real consequences. A particularly damning accusation might see you hauled before a church court or, at the very least, consigned to public penance. Kneeling barefoot in the mud while reciting psalms with a rock tied to your back to symbolize the unbearable weight of your sinful thoughts. Of course, the irony was that no one actually followed all these rules. Human beings, as ever, were far too messy and impulsive for that. For every sermon about chastity, there was a hayloft rendezvous. For every pious lecture on purity, a hastily scribbled poem hidden beneath a straw mattress. People loved in secret, in silence, in defiance of parents, priests, and prudence. They clung to the few moments when the world's gaze slipped away. A quiet path between fields, a shadowed corner of the market, the stolen half-hour before the evening bells. There were even those infamous churchyard meetings, scandalous in their day, where couples claimed to be visiting family graves and instead whispered endearments behind tombstones. Some villages forbade single men and women from visiting cemeteries unattended, lest the mournful atmosphere stirred dangerous affections. But of course, it did. There was something about the hush of the graveyard, the flicker of candlelight through a chapel window, and the scent of late summer roses that made declarations of eternal love feel, well, appropriate, if slightly morbid. But what's life without a little morbidity in your romance? And if graveyard trysts weren't your style, worry not, medieval folks had other ingenious ways to flirt dangerously. Feast days and seasonal festivals, for example, were a hotbed of illicit eye contact, coded gestures, and frankly ridiculous displays of courtship. In a world where daily life was a brutal rhythm of mud, hunger, and disease, festivals were rare, sacred opportunities to flirt under the thin, convenient excuse of communal celebration. You might spend months anticipating one, not for the dancing or the roast lamb, but for the fleeting, glorious chance to lock eyes with the cooper's daughter without a priest hovering behind you, quoting Leviticus. These festivals were a strange mixture of rigid religious ceremony and joyous, drunken chaos. Villagers would gather by torchlight, hang garlands from the oaks, and down more ale in a single evening than they'd usually see in a month. There would be games, wrestling matches, sack races, and contests involving increasingly absurd combinations of livestock and ladders. All of them brilliant excuses for young men to display their dubious athletic prowess in front of the village's eligible women. And then, of course, the dances, the medieval equivalent of speed dating, only with less privacy and a greater chance of slipping on manure. Dances were strictly choreographed, with specific steps and prescribed partners. But there was always a moment, a spin too long, a hand held a fraction too tight, when something more flickered through the routine. A slight squeeze of the fingers as you passed, a whispered jest too soft for the chaperone to catch. These were the secret languages of medieval love, more eloquent than 100 overwrought poems. Speaking of poetry, the troubadours and minstrels who wandered from manor to tavern were another key player in the strange theater of medieval romance. These traveling musicians were equal parts celebrity, gossip monger, and emotional saboteur. They carried news of noble affairs, common scandals, and the occasional tale of forbidden love defying all odds. Their ballads spoke of perfect, impossible love, knights dying dramatically for their ladies, noblewomen wasting away in towers, peasants outwitting cruel lords for the hand of their beloved. None of it particularly practical, all of it desperately alluring. For a coin or a favor, a minstrel might compose a verse about you and your secret love. Of course, this came with risks. In small communities, anonymity was a myth. If someone sang a love ballad about a flaxen-haired maiden and a lad known for his wonky nose, it wouldn't take long for everyone to put names to the lyrics. And heaven help you if the rhyme was bad. Eyes like a summer sky was one thing, teeth like milky curds quite another. But even so, people commissioned songs. They scratched poems into tree bark. They etched initials into the soft walls of barns and scribbled crude hearts onto scraps of parchment. Love in this grim and practical world was both a rebellion and a necessity, a flicker of warmth against the endless cold. And not all romances were doomed or secret. Some, against all odds, blossomed into something resembling happiness. Peasant couples, bound by labor and mutual necessity, often developed genuine affection. You might not compose odes to your wife's hands, rough and cracked from hours at the loom, but you'd notice the way she hummed while mending your tunic, or how she saved you the crispiest bit of roasted turnip. Love was practical, enduring, and largely unspoken. A long look across a table, a shared joke over a stubborn goat. Even among the nobility, arranged marriages sometimes turned unexpectedly tender. History remembers the scandals and betrayals, but hidden among them were quiet, steady partnerships forged in the fires of shared adversity. Two people who learned to respect, to endure, and eventually to love one another in the face of courtly intrigue and familial ambition. Not every marriage was a battle. Some were truces. Some, in rare and precious cases, became friendships. And really, that was the thing about medieval love. It was rarely the grand, operatic affair sung by minstrels. More often it was quiet, awkward, practical, and stubborn. It endured through illness, famine, and endless winters. It was born not of fairy tales, but of long days in the fields, of shared grief, of stolen smiles beneath storm clouds. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was human. And as with every good love story, especially the medieval kind, eventually comes the small matter of scandal. Because for all the carefully arranged marriages and calculated alliances, hearts had a bothersome habit of disregarding strategy. Illicit love affairs happened, and when they did, they set entire villages and courts ablaze with gossip. It wasn't so much the affair itself that scandalized people. It was the consequences, the delicious, messy unraveling of order. Take the case of secret rendezvous. The classics were haylofts, herb gardens, and the treacherous shadowed corners of castle kitchens after curfew. There was something about the scent of fresh bread mingled with the terror of discovery that made every whispered word feel like high poetry. If you were especially bold, you might slip a note inside a loaf, passed by a bribed servant, or arrange to meet beneath the old oak where lovers had met for generations, a spot already soaked with legend and a little dried blood. Of course, these affairs were rarely well-kept secrets. Medieval communities, whether villages or noble courts, were tightly woven tapestries of rumor. The baker's boy knew before you did. The washerwoman heard it from the steward. The priest learned it in confession, and naturally, so did his mother, who coincidentally lived across from the well where the two of you exchanged longing glances. Nothing escaped notice. And while some affairs fizzled into nothing more than a few blushes and one badly written poem, others spiraled into full-blown dramas. Consequences varied. If you were a peasant, you risked public penance, standing barefoot outside the church in your shift, holding a candle, while the congregation took turns pretending they hadn't been rooting for you. If you were noble, things got darker. Adultery among the aristocracy wasn't just personal, it was political treason. The wrong affair could unravel alliances, fracture estates, and ignite grudges that outlived their participants. A nobleman caught bedding another man's wife might find himself challenged to a duel, exiled, or hastily shipped off on pilgrimage to reflect on his sins, which often translated to a lengthy drinking tour of southern France. For noblewomen, the stakes were higher. A scandalous lady risked annulment, confinement to a convent, or worse, a particularly creative execution designed to make a moral example of her. The stories were gruesome, but still heart strayed, because they always do. Even in an age when marriage was currency and fidelity was a commodity, people sought out moments of tenderness, rebellion, and fleeting happiness. And lest we imagine it was all passion and poetry, let's not forget the bitter flip side: jealousy. Few things turned a feast hall sour faster than the unmistakable frost of a scorned lover. Men sulked, women plotted, and minstrels took notes. Sometimes jealous rivals would spread malicious rumors, accusing a rival of sorcery, poisoning, or worst of all, being descended from the neighboring village known for its unfortunate tendency toward goat-faced children. A good scandal could change fortunes overnight. In noble courts, these love feuds sometimes became open political warfare. Favors withdrawn, alliances snapped, tournaments suddenly taking on a slightly more homicidal tone. The occasional accidental, jousting death might conveniently remove an inconvenient rival. The court would mourn, the lady would discreetly refuse to speak to anyone for a week, and the troubadours would quietly compose a new ballad. The cycle never truly stopped, and yet people still risked it, because for all the rules, the eyes, the lurking consequences, love was one of the few unpredictable forces in a world that prized predictability above all else. Even in its messiest form, it reminded people they were alive. And really, what else was there? But if there was one thing medieval lovers feared more than scandal, more than gossip, more than being marched before the bishop to confess their sinful inclinations, it was the curse. Because in a world where medicine was guesswork and weather was blamed on God's fluctuating moods, people believed in magic. Not the cheerful, wand-waving, fairy godmother kind, but the heavy, earth-scented kind. The kind that lived in hedgerows and lingered in the shape of a twisted root. Jealous rivals, spurned suitors, and even meddling grandmothers would, on occasion, seek out the services of a cunning woman. The unofficial village herbalist, midwife, and minor sorceress rolled into one. She lived on the edge of town, in a cottage forever wreathed in smoke, surrounded by jars of unidentifiable things pickling in dark liquids. For a few coins, a promise of secrecy, or a favor to be named later, she might craft a charm to sour a rival's affections, bind two hearts together, or cause a particularly bothersome lover to develop an unfortunate rash. Curses were a delicate business. A dropped poppet in the path of your crush, a handful of nettles slipped beneath a lover's pillow, or a wax figurine pricked at midnight while whispering your victim's name. Most of it was harmless superstition, but belief gave these acts weight. If a man awoke feverish after refusing a woman's advances, the village would nod and murmur about the old ways. If a marriage turned cold, it wasn't a matter of human failing. It was an ill-starred union, perhaps doomed from the moment a raven circled the church steeple on the wedding day. Protection charms were common too. Ribbons braided with certain herbs, blessed tokens sewn into the lining of a tunic, or a silver coin hidden beneath a mattress to keep wandering spirits at bay. Lovers would exchange secret items: a ring rubbed with salt, a lock of hair tied with crimson thread, objects soaked in meaning and half-remembered folk magic. And in those dark, candle-lit corners of medieval Europe where old beliefs lingered longer than the church cared to admit, there were places you could go for stronger measures. Sacred springs where women might toss coins and mutter the name of their beloved. Ancient trees hung with scraps of cloth and bone, each one a prayer, a plea, a curse. Shrines not officially recognized but never fully outlawed, where offerings of bread and wine were left in hopes of swaying unseen forces. Because the truth was, beneath the starched collars and moral decrees, most medieval hearts believed the world was threaded through with mystery. That fortunes turned not only on land deals and dowries, but on the restless will of spirits, stars, and the long dead watching from beyond. That love was dangerous precisely because it defied order, and that perhaps was why people clung to it so fiercely. Because in a life so tightly ordered by fate, family, and faith, love remained one of the few things that could truly surprise you. It could defy a family's careful scheming, spark in the unlikeliest of places, survive war, famine, and scandal. It could outlive curses and outwit chaperones. It could hide in a glance, a touch, a ribbon tied to a sword hilt. It could make a peasant feel like a king or bring a monarch to his knees. It was impractical. It was reckless. It was, by all accounts, a terrible idea, but it was also somehow worth it. And so we come, inevitably, to the night before the wedding. A moment rarely sung about in ballads, but heavy with ritual and nerves nonetheless. Because if love in the Middle Ages was a precarious tightrope between duty and desire, the night before the vows was when it all came to a head. A time when hearts pounded, lips whispered half prayers, and everyone, from peasants to kings, wondered if they were about to make the right choice or the gravest mistake of their life. For the bride, it began with the bath. In wealthier homes, a tub was filled with scented water, herbs, and occasionally milk, though this depended on how many cows one could spare. It wasn't for hygiene so much as symbolism, a ritual purification meant to wash away youthful indiscretions, stray affections, and any lingering sins the priest might have missed. Friends and older female relatives would gather, offering well-meaning advice that ranged from the gently hopeful to the alarmingly specific. Tales of marital bliss were rare. More common were stories of difficult men, unyielding in-laws, and how to conceal bruises with a clever arrangement of headscarves. Meanwhile, the groom, far less ceremonially inclined, would drink. With his friends, his brothers, the village elder, the steward, anyone within arm's reach, really. The evening would devolve into boasts about future sons, exaggerated hunting stories, and nervous jokes about the coming night. Some were genuinely hopeful. Others, already mourning the freedom they were about to lose. It was as much about courage as celebration, liquid bravery against a lifetime of expectation. And in the hours before dawn, when the last torch guttered out and the revelers staggered home, there was a pause, a hush that settled over the village or the castle courtyard. The world held its breath, and in that space, hearts faltered. Hands reached for tokens, a ribbon, a ring, a scrap of parchment, and remembered old promises, old glances, old might-have-beens. A part of everyone understood that tomorrow was a boundary, that childhood, freedom, and foolish crushes ended at the chapel door. Of course, not all couples approached their wedding nights with dread. Some clung to hope. There were tales, always half-whispered, of couples who discovered affection in the quiet hours after the feast, who found laughter in clumsy touches, in tangled bedclothes and awkward first mornings, who built something steady and enduring out of duty's ruins. Love, it turned out, was sometimes stubborn enough to bloom even in the coldest soil. But before vows were spoken, there was one final ritual for many villages, the binding of hands. In some places it happened in secret, in others before the entire assembly. A cord, often red or gold, was tied around the couple's wrists, symbolizing not only their union but the binding of fortunes, bloodlines, and fates. The cord might be made of silk if you were noble, or rough flax if you were poor, but it meant the same thing: your lives were no longer your own. And then, inevitably, the bells. Their sound rolled across rooftops and fields, a summons none could refuse. The whole village gathered. The priest waited. The witnesses pressed in, eager to see whether the bride would smile, whether the groom would stumble on his vows, whether any last-minute drama might erupt. There was always a moment of strained silence before the first words were spoken, a breathless collective wondering whether anyone would object. They rarely did, not because love was always perfect or wise, but because the world turned on order, on bargains made and kept, on knowing one's place. And yet, every now and then, every 100 stories or so, someone would bolt. A groom fleeing down the lane, a bride vanishing into the woods, a pair of secret lovers slipping away in the pre-dawn mist. Their fates were almost always grim, but the stories survived, retold in alehouses and at winter hearths, proof that even in the Middle Ages, love had teeth, that it bit, it bled, it defied. And that, in the end, was what made it worth remembering. And so the wedding itself. You might imagine a grand procession, garlands of flowers, young maidens scattering petals before the bride. In truth, most medieval weddings were hasty, practical, and heavy on obligation. The wealthier the family, the more ceremony was demanded, and the more tedious the business became. If you were a peasant, your wedding might happen in a field, at the church porch, or in the village square, with a priest summoned from whatever urgent livestock blessing or burial he'd been halfway through. The important thing wasn't the feast, or the dancing, or even the vows. It was that everyone who mattered witnessed it. Witnesses were everything. In a world without written marriage certificates, you needed half the village to remember the day you spoke those words, in case anyone tried to claim you'd never married or you attempted to marry someone else a year later in the next village over. They would gather, squinting in the daylight, judging the bride's dowry and the groom's boots, already wagering on how long it would last. The ceremony itself was almost comically brief. A few Latin phrases, a confirmation of consent, usually phrased as whether you would have and hold this person, and perhaps a blessing if the priest wasn't in a hurry. Rings were not always exchanged, particularly among the poor. A clasp of hands was enough, though wealthier families might mark the union with a piece of silver or a token. And then came the bedding, a tradition far less romantic than the poets would have you believe. In noble households, it was a full public event. The couple escorted to their chamber by family and friends, accompanied by crude jokes, rowdy songs, and the occasional piece of ribald advice shouted through the door. The priest might offer a final blessing, or in some places, a witness would remain in the room until the marriage was technically consummated. An act considered so important it could determine the legitimacy of future heirs and the security of entire estates. For peasants, the bedding was slightly less formal, though no less communal in spirit. It was customary for friends to accompany the newlyweds to the threshold of their home, ensuring no ill-omened soul crossed their path. No jealous rival slipped a curse beneath their door. Practical advice was given, much of it less than helpful. "Don't let him eat onions before bed," someone's aunt would mutter. "Tie your hair up tight lest it tangle and give you nightmares," another would say. And then the door shut, the room stilled, and the couple was left to face one another without the comfort of witnesses, gossip, or expectation. It was, for many, the first honest moment of their entire courtship. Some found laughter in that awkwardness, others grief. Some resigned themselves to duty, and some, a lucky, stubborn few, discovered, to their great and bewildered relief, a kind of peace. A partnership not built on ballads or rebellion, but on the fragile, unspoken knowledge that whatever else the world might take from them, this space, this night, was theirs alone. Outside, the village would drink and dance long after the sun set. The church bells might ring again at midnight. A minstrel would compose a crude, forgettable song about the bride's blush and the groom's drunken stumble. Children would gather flowers and scatter them into the stream. Old women would debate the signs, the weather, the look in the bride's eyes. And in every village, every hamlet, every castle great and small, life would go on. The crops would be sown, the rivers would rise, and somewhere another glance would linger too long, another poem be scribbled in secret, another ribbon tied to a tree. Because though the names changed, the faces faded, and the years turned, the old story of longing, of risk, of impossible hope remained. It always did. In the weeks that followed, the village settled into its familiar rhythm, but something had shifted. Not in any way obvious, not with the thunderclap of scandal or the shattering silence of tragedy. No, it was more like the subtle lean of a tree toward the sun, imperceptible to those who passed it daily, but undeniable over time. The kind of shift that lives in the quiet between words, in the pause before a name is spoken, in the hush that follows a laugh that's just a touch too forced. At the market, the baker's daughter no longer blushed when she handed out sweet rolls, though she still wrapped them in parchment folded with care. The stable boy, The one who had once watched the wedding procession with a hollow ache behind his eyes, now took the longer path to the river, just to avoid passing the chapel. And the priest, who had married the couple with a smile carved from duty and years, found himself staring too long at the candle flames during Vespers, whispering prayers that he did not remember learning. Inside the newlyweds' cottage, time softened the edges of strangeness. The linens no longer smelled foreign, the creak of the door became familiar music, and the silence, once sharp and weighted, began to hum with small comforts. They spoke more now, not of grand things, but of whether the roof might need mending, or if the stew needed more salt. They laughed sometimes. He told her of the hawk he'd once seen snatch a fish from the stream with such grace it had looked like a dance. She recounted how, as a child, she used to press wildflowers between the pages of hymnals and forget which ones were sacred and which were weeds. But even peace has shadows. Some nights when the wind rattled the shutters just so, she'd wake with her hands clenched, a name caught behind her teeth. Not his. And some mornings, as he laced his boots, he'd glance at the door and hesitate, just long enough to remember that the world outside was still watching, still whispering, still waiting for something to break. The village, for its part, pretended not to notice. It celebrated feast days with more fervor than before. Children were taught not just to listen to stories, but to ask the right questions, the kind that could be passed off as curiosity when overheard. And the old widow who had once declared the bride's eyes too knowing, took to sitting outside the tavern each evening, humming lullabies no one could place. And all the while the land moved forward. Snow melted. Shoots pierced the soil. The river, unbothered by memory or rumor, carved its steady path as it always had. But under that ordinary surface, in the soil and the silence, something waited. Not a secret exactly, not a threat, just possibility. The kind that clings to stories unfinished, to love unproven, to hearts still unsure of which rhythm to follow. Because though the vows had been spoken, and the names recorded in ink and prayer, not all stories end at the altar. Some only begin there. But what then comes after the wedding? After the blush fades, the guests return to their fields, and the wine has turned sour in its forgotten cups. What does love become when the fire is no longer symbolic, but something you must actually tend, stick by stick, against the encroach of winter? Marriage in the medieval world was not a crescendo but a beginning. A long, slow symphony of duty and endurance, sometimes with notes of affection, sometimes with the dissonance of disappointment. It was less about the ceremony and more about the rhythm that followed. Waking to the same person's breath each morning, weaving together your chores, your meals, your prayers, learning the sound of someone else's silence. For many couples, love came not with lightning but with familiarity. You learned the weight of your spouse's footsteps, the way they peeled turnips, or sang to the geese, or wiped their hands on their trousers even when a cloth was right there. Romance was redefined, not as grand gestures but as small, invisible kindnesses. A blanket tucked in tighter on cold nights, bread left unburned, the remembering of someone else's least favorite herb and leaving it politely out of the stew. Still, it wasn't always soft. Sometimes marriages were cold things, brittle and formal, a pair of strangers sharing a roof and the burden of survival. Some households moved like clockwork, efficient, impersonal, polite. Others grew to resent their ticking, each hour a reminder of what might have been. The rarest grew wild, like ivy, messy, stubborn, beautiful only to those within. No matter the type, each had its own rhythm, its own unwritten treaty, its own language of glances and withheld sighs. Children came quickly, often too quickly, bringing with them sleepless nights and the heavy weight of lineage. A son was an heir, a daughter, a future bargaining chip. Their cries joined the bleating of goats and the shouting of hawkers in the morning chorus. A mother's love was assumed, a father's pride quietly measured in how straight the child walked or how much grain he could carry. There were no parenting manuals, only neighbors and gossip and instinct. And yet between feeding livestock and patching roofs, something fragile could grow. Laughter in the doorway, an argument about turnips that ended in a kiss, a moment where, amid the noise of survival, one remembered why they chose or were chosen at all. Not every union found this, but those that did held onto it like fire in winter. Of course, the village still watched. Neighbors had long memories and longer tongues. Any sign of discord became a cautionary tale, a raised voice. He drinks too much. A woman walking alone to the stream. They've quarreled. A house too quiet, unnatural, probably cursed. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Love had to grow, if it could, in the narrow spaces between obligation and observation. And even then, temptations remained. The traveling merchant with his clever smile, the widow with her orchard and her quiet, confident laugh. A glance in the wrong place at the wrong time could upend a life, but more often it simply lingered unspoken, unacted upon, a silent flicker that reminded you that you were still a person, not just a role. A wife, a husband, a parent, a provider. In noble halls it was much the same, though draped in finer cloth. Affairs were not uncommon, but discretion was a currency more precious than gold. Jealousy turned into political maneuvering, affection into alliances. A lord might keep a mistress. A lady might pour her heart into letters sent by falcon, each sealed with wax and longing. Their unions were performances. Their love, if it came, was a hidden, dangerous thing. But whether peasant or noble, man or woman, most learned the same truth. That love, real love, did not reside in the wedding vows or the first touch or the carefully composed ballad. It lived in the long days, in the compromise, in the tending. Because in a world where everything could be taken, crops, land, health, even names, what remained, if it was strong enough, was this quiet, enduring tether. Not flashy, not always visible, but there nonetheless. A glance across a shared table, a breath drawn in unison. A future neither grand nor guaranteed, but faced together, one frostbitten morning at a time. But even the most weathered love, the kind grown thick and gnarled like old oak, was not immune to change. Time, after all, was the most tireless of architects, reshaping marriages, households, entire villages with the slow persistence of moss creeping over stone. In the beginning, love may have been nerves and ceremony, shared bread and tentative glances. Years later it became something else, not less, not always more, just different. Some couples hardened. Their conversations became tools. Did you mend the gate? The pig's gone lame again. They spoke not from coldness, but from the weight of surviving together. Love didn't vanish. It just tucked itself behind routine, behind the daily labor of keeping hearth and soul intact. You knew it was still there in the way she poured his drink before her own, or the way he rose to fix a leak before she noticed the drip. Others mellowed. The walls came down slowly over years. The stoic husband who once grunted his feelings might one day brush a curl from his wife's cheek without comment. The quiet wife who kept her hands busy to avoid awkward silences might eventually lean into those silences, let them stretch, become comfortable. You could tell such couples by the way they moved in sync, not dramatically, not with flourish, but like two creatures who'd spent a long winter curled beside the same fire and had grown used to each other's shape. And then, of course, there were the ones who drifted, not through cruelty but through distance. A marriage could remain intact on paper and still feel like walking beside a stranger. Maybe they loved once, maybe they never did. Maybe life just demanded too much, too many mouths to feed, too many seasons of failed harvests. The world didn't offer time for soul searching. It offered wood to chop, debts to settle, and children to raise. Sometimes love got lost along the way, tucked behind responsibility, never quite recovered. In the quiet spaces between those outcomes lived another possibility, friendship. Rare, hard one, but more enduring than infatuation. It was built not on fluttering hearts, but on shared griefs and small victories. The death of a child, the unexpected survival of a winter, the first laugh after a long illness. These things forged bonds deeper than the blush of courtship. It was not glamorous. It did not inspire troubadours, but it lasted. Still, the world outside never stopped testing that bond. Illness crept in like fog, war rolled through like thunder, famine pressed its bony fingers into every cupboard, and always the church watched, offering judgment in one hand and comfort in the other. The priest would speak of divine order, of God's plan for husband and wife, of obedience and grace. But behind closed doors, even he sometimes whispered prayers he wasn't sure anyone heard. And through it all, people clung to their rituals. The morning kiss, however brief. The way she stirred his broth just the way he liked it. The way he sharpened her favorite shears without being asked. Not because they were dramatic declarations, but because, in a world so quick to break what it built, these small acts were anchors. You could walk through any village and see them. Not the couples you noticed at feasts or heard about in scandalous verse, but the quiet ones. The man carrying an extra cloak in case she forgot hers. The woman who knew the creak in the floorboard near his chair and never stepped on it after he'd gone to sleep. These were the true romances, unadorned, uncelebrated but solid. And even at the end, when one spouse passed, as they inevitably did, for no vow ever outlasted time, the other would carry on, sometimes in grief, sometimes in stoic acceptance, sometimes with a quiet, relieved sorrow, like someone gently closing the last page of a very long book. They would still set the table for two, out of habit, still murmur a comment aloud before remembering no one was there to answer, still dream, occasionally, of the early days of the ribbon tied around the wrist, the maypole dance, the laugh shared in secret by the river's edge, because love, even in its most weathered form, left a shape behind. And so life continued, not in grand declarations, but in the soft repetition of days. Love, once daring and dangerous, became woven into the very structure of things. The lean of the roof over the cottage door, the well-worn path to the stream, the names whispered in prayer at night. It was no longer a story told aloud. It became the silence between sentences, the pause in a song, the way a hand lingered a second longer when passing a bowl of stew. But every so often, that silence was broken by the next generation. Because even as old love quieted into memory, new love arrived, loud and awkward and full of wild hope. Sons and daughters, once swaddled in worry and soup-stained tunics, now stood on the edge of their own stories. And with them came the cycle again. The nervous glances, the carved spoons, the sudden interest in church attendance. Fathers watched their daughters like hawks, convinced no lad with a full head of hair could be trusted. Mothers sharpened their tongues and instincts in equal measure, warding off unsuitable suitors with a single glance that could strip bark from a tree. And still, young love found its way in. Through the cracks, under fences, behind the hedgerows, because there is no locking out the ancient pull of a glance held too long. A boy might linger after market day, pretending to examine apples he had no intention of buying. A girl might take the longer path home, past the blacksmith's, though it meant muddying her shoes. A ribbon might reappear mysteriously tied to the barn gate, or a poem, misspelled, smudged, and hopelessly earnest, might be tucked beneath a wooden plate. And behind each gesture, the heavy presence of parents, neighbors, priests, and the whole weight of medieval society frowning through the window. But love is nothing if not persistent. Eventually, the courtships began anew. Different names, different faces, same dances. The same guarded meetings at harvest feasts. The same secret smiles exchanged over shared chores. And slowly, inevitably, the questions returned. Who is his family? What does he bring? Can she cook? Can he build? What did the midwife say about the line of her hips and the strength of his shoulders? The romance may have started with flowers, but it always ended in negotiations. The elders tried not to laugh, or at least not while watching. They saw themselves in the stumbles, in the awkward declarations, and the bashful offerings of wool and eggs and rosemary sprigs. They whispered warnings, not to be cruel, but because they remembered. They remembered the ache of waiting for a returned glance, the fear of a father's verdict, the weight of the wrong match, the longing for the right one. And in their way, they tried to steer the course, A quiet word with a boy about responsibility. A gentle reminder to a girl that charm fades faster than a loaf of rye left near the fire. But they knew, deep down, that it wasn't theirs to stop, just to witness. And so the village turned, season by season, story by story. Love in all its forms, foolish, sturdy, terrifying, returned. It slipped past every guard and rule. It rode in on horses, on carts, on the backs of songs. It threaded itself into the laundry, into the grain, into the thrum of daily life. Always changing, yet somehow always the same. It might end in marriage. It might not. It might leave a heart cracked like old pottery, or carry two people into old age, arguing about onions and roof tiles. But always, always, it made the world feel briefly less predictable, less practical, less doomed. And that was enough to keep it alive. And in time, even those stories of courtships won and lost, of weddings and ribbons and whispered meetings in moonlit fields, began to settle like dust into the corners of the village. What had once been burning immediacy became recollection. A smile passed down in family resemblance. A line in a song no one quite remembered writing. The old lovers became names etched into pews, or stones moss-covered and half-forgotten in the graveyard beyond the chapel wall. But still the stories were told. Not always accurately, never accurately, if we're being honest, but told nonetheless. Around hearths in winter. At weddings, in the nervous laughter of those about to step into the very same dance. At feasts after the third mug of ale, when tongues loosened and eyes misted. Grandmothers would gesture vaguely at the horizon and say, "I once knew a man who walked 3 villages to leave a ribbon on a girl's doorstep." And no one would ask for proof. They didn't need to. Because in every village, there was always one love story that outlived its participants. A romance that bent time, refusing to fade. Maybe it ended in marriage or tragedy or mystery. It didn't matter. It became part of the soil. A tale mothers told to distract children during storms. A caution to the headstrong. A comfort to the lonely. Sometimes it was the story of a girl who ran off with the falconer, leaving behind nothing but a comb and a half-finished quilt. Other times it was a tale of forbidden lovers who carved their initials into an oak that still stood, crooked and whispering, long after their names had vanished from every parish record. The stories weren't preserved for their accuracy. They were kept for what they meant, that love had happened here. That someone once had risked it all for the flicker of another soul. And as years turned and generations passed, the rituals changed. The maypole fell out of use. Minstrels became memory. The church tightened its grip or loosened it, depending on the century. But the core remained. The need to seek, to yearn, to tie something fragile to another and pray it holds. The trappings altered, the verses, the dowries, the customs of proposal, but the ache did not, nor the hope. Even the architecture began to tell these stories. A window left larger on one side because it once faced the cottage where someone waited. A bench carved with symbols no one understood, except that they were always touched lightly by those passing by. A set of mismatched stones at the bridge where 2 lovers used to meet. No one fixed them, not even the mason's apprentices, though they stumbled every time. It was understood. Love leaves marks, and every so often in the silence of a summer dusk or the hush before the harvest moon rose, you could feel them. Not ghosts exactly, but echoes. The air seemed to hum a little, like someone had just left the room, like someone had just laughed here, just touched a hand, just whispered a name. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep it going, to make the next glance linger, to make the next poem clumsy and sincere, to make the next pair of hands reach for each other across whatever rule, distance, or silence still remained. Because no matter how many years passed, how many seasons of flood or famine, how many names slipped quietly out of the world, love always found its way back. It always did. And so love, older now, no longer demanded the spotlight. It didn't shout. It didn't plead. It simply lived quietly, like moss on a stone, like the warmth that lingers after a fire has gone out. It no longer needed the validation of minstrels or the spectacle of village festivals. It was past all that. It had nothing left to prove. You could find it in the stillness, in the old couple sitting on the chapel steps after Mass, not speaking, just watching the clouds roll in the widow who still swept the path up to the orchard, long after her husband was buried beneath it, in the man who carved a new stool each winter though no one asked, always placing one in front of the fire, just in case someone came by. These were not declarations. They were habits, holy ones in their own way. And perhaps that was the secret. That love, the real kind, the kind that lasts, was never about grand gestures. It was about presence, about choosing over and over again to stay, to get up on cold mornings and share silence, to fight and come back anyway, to notice, to remember. And in a world so full of hunger and toil, of war drums and long winters, that kind of devotion became its own form of defiance. But still, sometimes, love surprised even the oldest hearts. The widower who remarried in his 60s, not out of loneliness, but joy. The woman who laughed again for the first time in 20 years when a traveling juggler dropped all his apples. The nun who kept a box of pressed violets and a name she never shared. Love did not recognize age. It cared nothing for propriety. It returned in strange ways, in shared bread, in a song hummed at the right moment, in a second glance that shouldn't have mattered but did. And always, always it left something behind. Even the unrequited loves, the heartbreaks, the silent sacrifices that never bore fruit, they carved small channels into the world. A lilt in a melody, a certain bitterness to the wine in one region, a superstition passed down that no one quite explained. Love shaped things, even when it didn't last. And perhaps that was why the stories kept returning, long after their subjects had faded. Why children still dared to write crude poems with berry juice on barn walls. Why a girl would still tie a ribbon to a tree that hadn't bloomed in years. Why an old man would still linger by the stream where he'd once waited for someone who never came. Because some part of us always hopes that love might echo, that it might find another voice, that it might start again. And it did, even in new villages, new lands. The world changed, plagues came, borders shifted, languages tangled, but people still gathered. They still danced, still fretted over wedding bread and what color flowers to wear, still tied tokens to branches and whispered wishes into the night. The settings altered, the stakes evolved, but the desire remained painfully, beautifully the same, to be known, to be chosen, to be loved. And somewhere in every age a candle was lit, a vow was whispered, a risk was taken. Two hands found each other in the dark, and everything began again. And in time, long after the feast halls had crumbled, after the stones of the church had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, after the names of the original lovers were whispered only by wind and the pages of forgotten books, the villagers still told the stories. Not with accuracy, not with dates or proofs, but with feeling and a kind of reverence. They told them because something in those old tales felt like memory, even if it wasn't their own. The names shifted, the settings changed. The ribbon became a locket, the barn became a garden, but the shape of the story held. Always there was a glance, always there was a barrier, always there was a moment small and glittering where someone chose to reach across whatever chasm lay between them. And that moment, whether it ended in joy or ruin, became sacred. By then, love was not a private thing. It had become inheritance. Children grew up hearing not just what love was, but what it could be: defiant, gentle, ridiculous, terrifying. A girl would hear that her great-grandmother once wrote a letter to a man who had already promised himself to another, that she never sent it, but kept it beneath her pillow for 40 years. A boy would learn that his grandfather walked 3 miles every Sunday just to see a woman sweep her porch, and that he never spoke to her once. These stories weren't told for entertainment. They were told as if they mattered, as if the ache of them had helped shape the very ground they walked on. And in a way they had. Love, foolish, fragile, burning, was the softest part of history, and also the most enduring. It didn't reshape empires or redraw maps. It didn't sit on thrones or command armies, but it lingered in architecture, in language, in lullabies. You could trace it in the curve of a window built to catch the light just so. In the recipe passed down that calls for honey just the way she liked it. In the way a field was left wild, not because it was useless, but because someone once danced there. It became tradition, but not the stiff kind, not the kind enforced by law or fear. This tradition was breath, a rhythm, a choice made again and again, not because it was required, but because it was beautiful. And sometimes, even in the modern world, someone would return to the village, a visitor, a scholar, a descendant of someone no one quite remembered. They'd wander the uneven roads, feel the stories underfoot, and say, "There's something about this place." And the villagers, if they liked you, would smile and say nothing. Because how do you explain that what you're feeling is centuries of love stitched into the very air? Not everything has to be explained. Some things are meant to be felt. So the stories continued. A ribbon still tied each spring to the old oak, no one knowing why, but no one willing to stop. A festival where couples stepped around a fire, for luck, they'd say, though no one remembered when it began. And behind every superstition, every quaint little ritual, the same old truth pulsed quietly on. Someone loved once and it mattered. And somewhere, even now, someone does. And so the world kept turning as it always does. Empires rose and fell, kings crowned and unseated, borders drawn and erased like chalk on a rain-slick stone. But love, stubborn, tender, quietly immortal, simply kept going. It asked no permission. It changed shape when it had to, slipped past politics and plagues, adapted like ivy to stone and shadow. Where it could no longer walk openly, it whispered. Where it was forbidden, it became code. Where it was mocked, it became myth. And myths, as the old folk will tell you, are very hard to kill. Even in times when love was considered inconvenient, too poor, too queer, too unapproved, it found its way. In secret letters written and burned before sunrise. In shared songs hummed low, meant for one set of ears. In glances that lasted just a little too long. Love didn't need a wedding to make it real. It didn't require land deeds or rings or church bells. It only needed two people foolish or brave enough to try. Because at its core, love has always been an act of rebellion, against loneliness, against silence, against the world saying, "You cannot." Every love in every age, no matter how proper or doomed or quiet, was someone choosing to hope. To see another and say, "Yes, even here, even now, even if nothing else comes of it." That choice, that first reaching out, was the real vow, and it changed people, even when it didn't last. Even when it ended in aching silence or bitter partings. Even when the lover left or died or forgot. Love left its mark. It taught you how to see differently, how to soften, how to risk. It carved out a space in you that never quite closed again, not to hurt, but to remind. To remind you that once, the world had shimmered a little more brightly, because of someone else's breath in it. So the stories endured not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Because they carried within them all the mess and courage and contradiction of real people trying to love in an unkind world. Because they showed us what we are: frail, foolish, full of longing, and what we might be if only for a moment. And somewhere always there was another beginning, a new village, a different festival, a stranger passing through, a girl watching the horizon, a boy writing a name he hadn't said aloud. And though they might not know the old stories, they stepped right into their shape. The script was already waiting. Meet, yearn, dare, lose, maybe, just maybe, hold on. Because though time wears down stone and fire consumes parchment, love leaves its mark where neither can touch. In the hollows of hearts, in the rhythm of footsteps returning home, in the silence between two breaths drawn in the dark. And when asked why these stories matter, the answer is always the same. Because someone loved once, and that is enough. And perhaps the strangest thing about love, the most miraculous, maddening, unsolvable thing, is how little it asks for to stay alive. It does not require full sentences. It does not demand certainty. Sometimes, all it needs is a name spoken aloud when no one is listening, a place revisited, a hand placed over one's own heart, remembering the weight of another that once rested there. The stories we tell about love are often dressed up in flowers, in fate, in poetry. But when you strip them down to the bone, they're simple. A glance, a question, a risk. And whether that risk was rewarded or ruined becomes secondary. What matters, what truly echoes, is that someone dared. That someone, even knowing the odds, still stepped into the unknown and said, "Here I am." And in that risk, something eternal was built. Not a monument, not a kingdom, but a moment. A small, perfect pulse in time where the world shimmered with possibility. People think love is loud. And sometimes it is, in the flush of youth, in the storm of defiance, in the thrill of the chase. But the kind that lasts, the kind that becomes myth, is often barely a whisper. It hides in ordinary things. A worn chair never moved because that's where they like to sit. A scarf kept at the bottom of a drawer long after its scent has faded. A corner of the garden still cleared every spring because they once said they liked the view. Those acts, small, unremarkable to anyone else, are where the real stories live. Not in the ballads, not in the carved initials or the wedding feasts, but in what comes after. In choosing again and again, even when the butterflies are gone, even when the world stops applauding. And eventually, that love, quiet, old, steadfast, becomes something else. It becomes shelter, not just for the lovers themselves, but for those who come after. For children raised beneath its roof, who grow up learning not from lectures, but from the sound of gentle laughter, from the steadiness of two people who kept choosing each other. For neighbors who see how kindness can linger. For strangers who pass by and feel something settle in their chest without knowing why. The greatest loves are rarely remembered for their beginnings. They are remembered for their staying, for the years, for the scars weathered together, for the fact that when the storms came, and they always came, neither ran. And when one is finally left alone, as love always demands in the end, there is grief, yes, but also something else. A hush, a warmth, the slow, sacred folding of a life shared. And in that folding, the memory remains not as pain, but as proof. Proof that love was here, that it mattered. And it's there in that quiet remembering that the story begins again. A new glance, a new risk, a ribbon tied to a new tree. The same song, sung slightly differently. Because no matter how much the world changes, no matter how fast, how cruel, how loud, some stories will always find a way to return. Especially the ones about love. It always began the same way, not with fanfare, not with a prophecy, but with a glance, a moment so small it could have passed unnoticed. A simple thing, a shared silence at the market, a brush of hands in the millhouse doorway, a pause just a beat too long before someone said goodbye. It was never dramatic, never worthy of a troubadour's quill. And yet, it was how everything began. In one particular village, it had no name you'd remember, just crooked chimneys and muddy streets and a tree that bloomed too early each spring. This was how the next story unfolded. The girl's name was not written in any history, though her family had tilled the same stretch of land since before the oldest gravestones had begun to lean. She was not remarkable, save that she watched everything with the quiet patience of someone who listened before speaking. She had a scar along her wrist from a childhood accident, and she always tucked her hair behind her ears when nervous. The boy, though boy was a generous word for someone whose back bore the weight of his father's debts, worked with horses. Not because he loved them, but because it was the only trade left to him after the river had taken their crops 3 years in a row. He was taller than most, with hands always stained from leather and lye, and eyes that rarely met your own unless he trusted you. They didn't meet dramatically. He delivered feed to her cottage. She carried out scraps for the birds. The first words spoken between them were not clever or flirtatious. They were, quite literally, about the weather, but something shifted. Maybe it was how she lingered that day, rather than turning straight back to the door. Or the way he paused before taking the reins, his thumb tracing the edge of the cloth she'd used to bind the bundle. Whatever it was, something unseen and irreversible took root. A seed buried too deep for either of them to notice, not yet. The village, as all villages did, noticed. not immediately. But villagers were born gossips, and in a place where seasons marked the pace of life, a look held too long in spring might become prophecy by winter. There were whispers before there were smiles. Old women with tight braids and looser tongues asked pointed questions. The priest, who had once blessed the boy after his father's drowning, began inserting extra lines into his sermons about purity of heart and the dangers of distraction. None of it mattered, because slowly and perhaps inevitably, the glances turned into greetings, the greetings into shared paths home, the paths into hours that neither could fully explain later. They spoke of small things: the price of barley, the nesting habits of sparrows, the way the river always looked wider when you were sad. But beneath each word was the hum of something older than speech. He carved her a comb, not because it was beautiful, but because her hair always got caught on the wind, and he had nothing else of worth to give. She didn't praise it, just used it the next day and never said a word. That was how love began in this place, not with declarations, but with quiet, ordinary proof. Still, it was not simple. Her father had already been approached by the Cooper's family, who had 3 sons and land closer to the riverbank. Marrying the horseboy made no sense. No cows, no inheritance, no strong name. Her mother, kind though she was, warned her gently, folding laundry between her palms like worry. "The heart can't plow fields," she said, "and love doesn't pay the tithe." He knew it too. Knew it in the way he avoided her gaze when others were near. Knew it in how he never asked for more than a walk, a word, a pause at the fence. He didn't beg, he didn't plead. He simply stayed near until he couldn't. Because then came the letter. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to the family. The Cooper's eldest son, formal and humorless, had written with the help of the village scribe. It spoke of union and property, of binding agreements and useful future children. There was no mention of love, of course. Only obligations. Her father, a practical man shaped by too many bad harvests, placed the letter by the fire and called it fate. She didn't cry. That would have been a luxury. Instead, she walked to the fields before dawn and stood alone where the wheat used to grow. She stood there for a long time, and that afternoon she did not braid her hair. She did not use the carved comb. She did not go to the stream where she knew he would wait, nervously picking at his sleeve, already practicing what he would not say. That night, the boy did not sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the rafters of the loft above the stables, and wondered, not for the first time, what it would mean to leave, to vanish down the trade road, to disappear before the ache settled into something permanent. But love, true love, is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is stubborn. Sometimes it waits. And the next morning she was there, not at the field, not at the stream, at his door. She didn't speak, just handed him a ribbon, not red, not golden, just plain linen frayed at the edges, soft from wear. It was the cloth she had used the day they met, the one she wrapped around the feed bundle. She gave it to him and said, "Don't go," and he didn't. There were no miracles. Her family raged. The Cooper's son returned his letter torn in 2. The priest offered sermons that felt more like curses, but none of it mattered. They wed beneath the trees months later, when the first thaw made the earth soft again. It wasn't formal, it wasn't blessed, but the birds were loud and the sun was warm, and when he took her hand, it felt like something sacred. They had little. Some say they never owned more than a goat and a single pewter bowl, but they had each other, and somehow, impossibly, it was enough. They lived quietly. They grew old, and long after their names had been worn from memory, their story remained, retold in bits, reshaped by time, but always with that ribbon. That simple, soft ribbon, passed down from daughter to daughter, tucked into chests, tied to hair, used to bind bread on feast days. Because what they had, what they chose, became more than myth. It became a map, a reminder to anyone who dared to love, that sometimes the quietest yes can echo longer than any vow.